Hey, this is Jim Popkin, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
How often do you have two spies talking to you about your spy book? Does that happen ever?
It doesn't. It's great.
How cool is this? Yeah, so I have up above me, I have Gary Green, who is a career Air Force OSI agent. I myself is a counterintelligence agent from the Army. And I just think it's Gary actually is the one that said, "Hey, you got to get Jim on the show to talk about this book, Code Name Blue Wren, and this incredible spy story." And I just I'm going to have Calder Walton on the show next week, and he's got a whole litany of spies in his book, and it's just an amazing thing when you think about the successful operations, whether they're against the U.S. or U.S.'s successful operations or against Britain, all these places. The best spies, you just don't know about them for decades if you ever find out about them.
Yeah, and if you want to jump in here, this my book is about a spy named Ana Montes, an American woman raised primarily in the Baltimore area, went to the University of Virginia for undergraduate degree. Her father was in the Army, and she became a spy for Cuba. She successfully spied for Cuba for 17 years. That entire time, she was working for the Pentagon at the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as an analyst, and became our government's top Cuba analyst. And to your point, I mean, she was really good at what she did, mostly kept her head down, and was able to have this successful spy career for almost 2 decades.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing to. So I had a long time ago, I had Jim Barsky on the show. And if you guys know Jim, Jim was a sleeper agent from what then was East Germany. And one of the things I know about being a counterintelligence agent is to hide from me, you've got to cover your traces all the time. And you're trying to communicate for him nationally across the ocean. And it's just not easy to do that. So you've got to have 2 jobs, really 3 jobs, because you're trying to look for surveillance, you're trying to avoid detection, you're trying to use in this the picture for this episode, I used the one-time pad. You're always encoding and decoding all of these things and trying to, am I being detected? How do I avoid being detected? And then you also have to do your job to get information to your agent or to the. So talk a little bit about how she divided up all of her work that she had to do, in addition to her exemplary work for the DIA.
Yeah, she really, I like how you frame that, Pete. She had 2 jobs, basically. So, her day job is with the DIA. She's an analyst, and she goes in like clockwork, works 9 to 5, takes lunch at her desk. Pardon me. And all she's doing all day long is reading reports. She had access to a very broad range of classified information, and she's sitting there and just memorizing. She learned early on that it would be too risky to take documents out of the building, out of the DIA. So she had a pretty good memory. In fact, as part of the research for the book, I gained access to her library, which her sister holds on to now, and I'll get into her sister in a second. But I found a book on improving your memory with all these lines underlined that Ana had used. And so she would sit there and memorize classified documents, the ones that she knew Cuba would mostly be interested in. And then at the end of the day, her second job began. And what she would do is type all the important things that she had learned that day into her Toshiba laptop. They had the Cubans, who have an excellent intelligence service, had installed software on there which enabled her to easily encrypt everything that she was typing. So she'd type it up, and then every 2 to 3 weeks, she'd put everything onto a disk, and she would take the risk of meeting with a Cuban handler, generally in a restaurant, often Chinese restaurants, in DC, in safe areas near metros. And she would, discreetly pass the CD to the handler, and that's how she would pass her information to Cuba. The way she got information was the old school way. that spy services have used forever. So you'd have, in her case, there was often a woman in an audio booth in Havana who would just read a series of numbers, stations, broadcasts. So it'd be in Spanish. And if you happen to tune into this frequency on shortwave radio, you would just hear someone, it's like kind of otherworldly, the sound of it, just saying, dos, tres, cinco, cinco, dos, over and over, 150 word patterns of 5 numbers each. And it would repeat, and Ana knew when to listen to that. She'd write everything down and then load that into her Toshiba, and the code was in there, so it would spit out her instructions every week. And if you're the U.S. intelligence agency or anyone who stumbles upon it, you have no idea what they're saying unless you have the code. It's just gibberish and a bunch of numbers. So she was, I would say, not perfect, but she was very careful in her 17-year career and incredibly effective at what she did.
I have one question about the way in which she was getting the classified information over to Cuba. You said that she basically memorized what she had. Do you know if the government actually compared the documents she was memorizing with the document translation or whatever that she sent to Cuba? What percentage of accuracy that might have been?
A good question, Gary. The only thing that I'm aware of is once she was arrested, and just to catch your audience up, she was arrested right after 9/11, which is why very few people have heard about Ana Montes, who I argue is one of the more important spies up there with Hansen and Ames and others. But once she was arrested and pled guilty and agreed to cooperate, for months, the FBI and others came to her with documents that they knew that she had access to, classified documents from the DIA's SAFE system. SAFE was the acronym. And what they would do is obviously ask her at that point, okay, you had this, is this a document that you passed along? And she would say yay or nay and explain it. And she was, she was polygraphed to make sure she was being candid at the time. The only document that I'm aware of where they could really compare apples to apples is a document the FBI found on her laptop just prior to arrest, where she had conveyed a lot of information. She was not great at tech at all, so she should have deleted this document, but it lived on her hard drive, and really that's what helped convict her. I'm use that term loosely because she was not convicted but pled guilty, because the FBI was able to see, to your point, Gary, exactly what she had conveyed about a number of points to the Cubans, but they weren't able to do it in detail in the way that you were alluding to.
Yeah, I would suspect that she would summarize the essence of what the classified material was.
Mm-hmm.
To have it memorized word for word, I think, would be a very daunting task for her. Yet a summary could have all the important information in a short amount of, or a limited number of words.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
When you think about the tasking too, like, you could have a summary, hey, get us more of this, like dig in deeper here. What is the overall, like, what's the so what factor? Like, it's just stupid little Cuba, right? Like, who cares if Cuba gets all this stuff? They're militarily insignificant, and who cares if Spain finds out? And some of this stuff in the Soviet Union, like, honestly, what's the so what factor here?
Yeah, and it's a legitimate question, because Cuba, in terms of their military, they're absolutely a paper tiger, and they're really very little threat to the United States or our allies. But they were trained by the Soviets. They have a terrific intelligence service. They're scrappy. They're illegal, obviously as illegal as hell. they don't operate by the same rules that the CIA and FBI and other intelligence agencies operate under. You guys would know best, but the reason this matters is that Cuba would sell or trade classified information with the Russians and other enemies. So a couple things to keep in mind. She had access to all kinds of classified information, well beyond what would only be the purview of DIA. She had CIA, NSA information. So she turned over the real names of American assets, presumably CIA officers who were operating in Havana. That's a very dangerous game to play, obviously. No one is thought to have been executed or even imprisoned because of her information, but those intelligence operations that the U.S. had were worthless, immediately worthless, because the Cubans knew what we were up to. She also turned, excuse me, she also turned over information about a classified satellite that could be used and was being used not just against Cuba, but all of our enemies around the world. That satellite, which was enormously expensive and had been operating well, stopped functioning afterwards. So presumably the Cubans shared that information around. So she was quite damaging, and Cuba played this role in trading and selling information. So it didn't only go to the little island nation, it had a larger impact beyond them.
I think that one of the benefits to the other countries of buying the information from Cuba might have been simply to corroborate information that the other sources had already provided. And if they got that corroborated separately from the Cuba intelligence people, that would add a lot to the reliability of other spies that probably reported the same thing, that were targeted for that kind of information. She was not specifically targeted for that kind of information. And when you get data or intelligence from people that were not even targeted, that's very good corroboration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Another thing to keep in mind is that Ana Montes wasn't the only spy the Cubans had. In fact, so she was recruited, Ana was recruited by another Cuban agent or operative, an American woman who was born in Puerto Rico named Marta Velazquez. And I can name her because the Justice Department released a secret indictment of Marta Velazquez. Marta was at the Johns Hopkins graduate school called SAIS in Washington, and she met Ana. They were classmates. Ana was, at the time, very critical of the Reagan administration policy in Central America. So she was outspoken, got the attention of Marta. Marta had already been recruited by the Cubans, and they began working together. Marta took her to New York, where she met a Cuban intelligence officer. They traveled surreptitiously to Havana and got training with using wigs and fake passports. And at the same time, at SAIS, at this same small graduate school in Washington, there was a professor who years later, it turned out, also was a spy on behalf of Cuba. Point is, Cuba is a small nation, but they have quite a chip on their shoulder for good reason regarding the United States. And they've put a lot of money and resources at spying, less so on their military, but they're really good. And I'm sure you guys know that from your careers. But if you talk to almost any intelligence officer in the U.S., they'll agree with that and say that Cuba has always punched above their weight.
And you've identified a way to do this where it's really hard for America to counter this, is to find someone in a university and embed them there, and they can be a very soft agent, and they can just look for people that you hate to say radicalized, but ultimately that's the word we're going to have to use here, is you find someone who's impressionable, who's already kind of angry, and you just kind of feed that. And that's the person you're like, hey, we need to get some money and get this person to go abroad and just send them to Spain or to Cuba, wherever it is, and you allow that wound to fester, and then you pitch them, and you see what happens. And if it doesn't work, there's no real skin off your nose. You just try again and again every semester, every quarter.
Yeah.
You just iterate until you find the agents that you want. And that's just Cuba's effort. Like, let's not forget all of the other agencies, to include our friends.
Exactly. Exactly. You had at SICE, SICE has quite an issue with it. They're very vulnerable on this point. You had a Russian agent posing as a Brazilian student who recently was arrested, and the FBI revealed that he was actually an FSB agent working at SICE. So yeah, universities and grad schools are the classic recruiting ground. I'm sure our nation does it as well overseas, but you have China and Russia and Cuba and everyone else. Yeah, right, and a lot of our allies as well, finding impressionable young people, especially at graduate schools in DC or the Kennedy School in Boston. These are the up and comers. They're going to join the State Department. They're going to go to other major U.S. agencies, and it makes sense to put an investment in them. Just on that point about how clever the Cubans were, when Marta Velázquez identified Ana and they decided they wanted to try to recruit her, they didn't come to her right away and say, "Hi, we're Cuban agents and we want to recruit you." That would be very crass. So instead, what they did was say, You're opposed to Reagan's policy in Nicaragua and Sandinista, and the Sandinistas. We need a little help with translating some material. So they start her kind of very gently, and it was about Nicaragua initially, not about Cuba. But Cuba obviously had serious interests in what was going on in Nicaragua and El Salvador at the time. So they started her kind of gently and roped her in. And early on, they asked Ana to write her autobiography, essentially. And that was a brilliant move because it told the Cubans about her personality, her family, and ways to continue to manipulate her for years and years, which they did to great effect.
Other than the professor at the graduate school, do you know if during this time period there was the Daniel Ellsberg case where he disclosed a lot of military information because he was ideologically opposed and disclosed that, the Pentagon Papers. Do you know if that was a topic that might have been discussed in her circle of friends and might have encouraged her to do the same kind of thing?
I'm not aware of that. That would have predated when she was recruited and started this. So I can't answer that explicitly. I would make a distinction with Ellsberg being more of a, in my view, as a former journalist, really more of a whistleblower than obviously an intelligence asset, which Montes was.
But he had access or disclosed those Pentagon Papers in 1971, and she would have been a young high school and early college student around that period of time. And I would think that that might be a topic that might have been among her friends, at least.
Possible. Yeah, I think her motivation, by the way, she was never motivated by money, unlike, say, Robert Hansen and Rick Ames. Her motivation was really purely political. She took, in her 17-year career, only, probably less than $10,000. It's basically expenses in a way. The Cubans helped pay for a kind of crappy car that she had to go back and forth to DIA. They paid off her tuition bill, but just thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands. She could have really, enriched herself but that was not why she did this. She did it because she believed that the U.S. policy in Cuba has always amounted to bullying, and she thought it was immoral. And so that's why she became a spy.
When you look at,
Do you
go
know
ahead,
if
Gary.
I actually verified that she did not have any offshore accounts or any other accounts?
They did a full scrub of her, yeah. And she did. I'm just trying to think in terms of her assets. She owned an apartment in Cleveland Park in Washington, which she had to sell to finance her legal bill. She had a condo timeshare in the Caribbean, and that was really about it. And a junky old Toyota. She lived very, very, very modestly. I guess if you can say, owning a condo in the Cleveland Park area of Washington is modest. But she didn't. There was no flash to her. That was not ever her motivating principle.
And what about her life in general? Did she maintain a significant relationship? How was she with her immediate family? I mean, is she antisocial, or how do you make her life out to be?
She grew more and more antisocial. And what I haven't mentioned, the book gets into, it's obviously about the life of Ana Montes, but on a parallel track, I get into her sister, Lucy. Lucy Montes, totally coincidentally, took a job with the FBI in basically the same week that Ana decided to spy for Cuba. So you have Ana at DIA, and Lucy became an FBI translator. She ended up in Miami, and later in her career was assigned to a unit that was hunting for Cuban spies. And she had no idea until Ana was arrested. At one point, there were 4 members of the Montes family working for the FBI. There was Lucy, her then husband. They both worked for the Bureau. And then Lucy encouraged her brother and sister-in-law to become FBI special agents. And they did. They became FBI agents in Atlanta. So I just love that notion of the family Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
With 4 FBI agents and the most notorious Cuban spy of all time. They were all completely floored when the FBI informed them on September 20th, 2001, that Ana had been arrested for espionage and was a Cuban agent.
So this is one of my favorite things about. Oh, sorry, Gary. Go ahead.
Do you know if Ana disclosed to her Cuban handlers that she had this strong connection to the FBI?
It certainly was known. What I'm a little shaky on is whether she ever revealed any information about her family to Cuba. They certainly would have had a very strong interest. My guess is that that's where Ana drew the line, because in their relationship, as an example, between the 2 sisters, and they're less than 2 years apart, Ana stopped sharing any information about work at all, and wouldn't ask Lucy anything about her work. So she kind of created like a vacuum in a way, so that the speculation is that so that if she ever were arrested, she could credibly say, we never talked about work. She protected her sister in that way. If she had said, hey, I'm working on this project, what are you up to? Obviously that would open the door. But it became such an issue with Lucy that she had nothing to talk to her about. Ana never married. She didn't have children. Lucy had a family. But it was pulling teeth to get anything personal out of Ana Montes once she really got engaged as a spy. So you can look at it as, maybe she was protecting her family. It also just maybe the intense pressure of maintaining this lie, especially to your family members who are pretty, crafty, smart people working for the Bureau. And just deceiving all your colleagues, your friends for nearly 2 decades. It created immense psychological pressure on her. She started seeing a psychiatrist, taking medication to deal with her anxiety and depression, and started to manifest a lot of serious symptoms from this. As an example, she started to shower excessively. At one point, she had a really restrictive diet. She started eating only unseasoned boiled potatoes. A lot of kind of OCD habits at home. Another family member post arrest shared with me how she opened a bathroom closet, and all the soap was lined up perfectly in rows. She found it just to be very odd and creepy, the way that she started to kind of comport herself and live her life. And that's something. You guys talk a lot about spies on your show, and we tend to glamorize it through TV and movies. Spying is a very difficult, and unless you're a psychopath, it's hard to maintain that lie. For a long, long period of time, you're BSing everyone around you, everyone that you care about, everyone you work with. And I think for most normal people, that starts to add up and create a lot of pressure.
Yeah, that's why I asked the relationship question, because it's really hard to maintain a real loving relationship, because there's just no room for that thing in most cases, and that you do start to break mentally because the paranoia has to creep in. You're looking at everybody, every word, every whisper. You're having to project things on people that may or may not be true, and everything becomes something, and you're waiting, and the inevitable. Like, you're going to get caught at some point, and you really are driving yourself insane, and your handler is doing the best they can to try to manage that. Like, when you're trying to manage that, you may even pull that person out, but they're so valuable. It really comes down to the mission versus the person, and as long as they can take it, you keep them in there. The only thing you're worried about is having something bigger get compromised, and as long as that's not the case, you just saddle up that pony and you let it ride until the end, and if they break, they break, and you are trying to ride that line between when is it going to be too much and do we extract her, and they probably had that conversation in Cuba, like, is this too much? And then she's going to say, no, I can take it. Right. And so they have that conversation for sure along the way, but yeah, that you're not going to have a regular relationship. It becomes impossible.
She had a number of relationships with guys over the years, and kind of tragically at the end, she fell for basically a colleague who also worked an American who worked in the U.S. intelligence world, also dealing with Cuban issues. Now, he absolutely would have been a target for the Cubans. And she fell for this guy and really wanted to drop out and marry him. And the Cubans said, "It don't work that way. You're in for life." And that was very hard for her to hear. She gave up everything to do this. But let me, just because I don't want to create a sob story about Ana Montes. My book came out January 3rd of this year. Ana was released from prison on January 6th after serving more than 21 years. She had a 25-year sentence. She had time off for good behavior. So she did 21 years and change. She gets out and she moves immediately to Puerto Rico, which is where her parents were from. She has a cousin there who has stayed close to her. And upon release, she puts out a statement that was completely unapologetic and essentially says the U.S. policy in Cuba continues to be immoral. And I just thought, how remarkable. Here's a woman who is in prison for 21 years. Her whole family's in the FBI. She's completely humiliated them and obviously affected the good family name. And she gets out, and the first thing that she says is, the U.S. policy in Cuba is a disaster. Like, that's someone who feels feels this at her core, and is also unrepentant about what she did.
And none of her people in her family who were FBI agents, none of them were counterintelligence agents. Is that correct? And was there any repercussions on them at all? Like obviously, they're going to look into their background and extensively and make sure that they were still credible agents.
Her sister-in-law, Joan, did some counterintelligence work. She was a special agent, but she did some CI work. None of them were affected. And to me, this speaks to the FBI, the kind of credibility of the FBI. They obviously investigated the whole family, especially Lucy, wanted to make sure that this wasn't a ring. And through essentially wiretaps and reading mail and everything else and interviews, they quickly established that Ana was out there on her own. The family had no idea. There was a debate. None of the family members who were in the FBI were polygraphed post arrest. To do like a real CI polygraph at that point to really quiz them on what they knew, who they knew, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't done. The FBI made the determination that they were innocent, that they should not be held to any higher standard because of the sister, and they were all allowed to continue in their jobs, and they've all now retired. And so, yeah, it really did not harm their careers.
You commented that she's now living in Puerto Rico. Do you know how she financially supports herself? Is she eligible for any retirement funds or Social Security or anything like that?
I'm stretching my memory here. I think that she forfeited her retirement benefits when she pled guilty. I don't know how she's supporting herself. My hunch is that her family in Puerto Rico is helping her. She's on probation for 5 years. She's got all kinds of limitations on what she can do and with whom she can correspond and meet and all that. But yeah, I'm not sure. And her lawyer and Ana Montes have been very protective about that information.
And how in the world did she? I mean, normally, if you're found out doing this, you get your neck stretched or you spend your life in jail. How in the world did she get off on 20-something years? That's amazing.
Yeah, 21 years, 25-year sentence. There were a couple things. Number one, she was arrested in D.C. Now, this part is speculation, but she's a woman right after 9/11. And she had Plato Caceres was her lawyer. If you remember, Plato represented Hansen and a lot of really well-known defendants in D.C. He was a really skilled lawyer. He cut a great deal for her because you're right. I was mentioning the professor who was working for Cuba. He's in prison. He's in Supermax on a life sentence. What he did can't hold a candle to what Ana Montes did and the amount of information, the level of classification. Hansen just died in Supermax. That is the norm with a crime of this magnitude. She cut a great deal. She agreed to cooperate. And I do think that 9/11 had something to do with this. It may be that the Justice Department just didn't have the heart to chase this and potentially take it to trial. I mean, they never want to take spy cases to trial. But she got a very favorable deal, 25 years, got out in a little more than 21 years. And I think she's 66 now. So, she's got a long life ahead of her.
Yeah. That's crazy. That's crazy. Yeah. But I mean, what would be fair? Like given what she did and like what Aldrich James got and all these other people, I mean, that sounds like it's an amazing deal. What should she have gotten, you think?
Well, I that's not for me to judge. I'm just saying that typically, I think she's very fortunate that she didn't get a life sentence, given everything, all that she did, all that she revealed. I think she's very fortunate. Having said that, the prison that she was held in is outside of Fort Worth, and it's a prison within a prison, and it holds some of the most dangerous women in the country. It's basically a supermax on the federal level for female inmates. I start the book with an interview with Squeaky Fromm, who
Squeaky,
good old Squeaky. They were essentially cellmates in this very small prison with only about 24 women and beds. And Squeaky Fromm, for folks who don't remember, she was Charlie Manson's girlfriend, and she later attempted to assassinate President Ford with a handgun, and was thrown into prison. Ended up in the same facility as Ana Montes. When I talked to Squeaky, whose real name is Lynette, I said, well, what was she like and what were the conditions? And Squeaky Fromm said, oh, Ana really had it hard. She had much more restrictive conditions than I did. And I thought, that says it all. Squeaky Fromm, Charlie Manson's lover and a would-be presidential assassin, is saying that Ana Montes had a tougher prison life than she did. That is something, something remarkable.
I wanted to go back to one other thing that I thought was very significant, and that's the role of the NSA analyst who essentially broke the case, but she was apparently treated poorly in the beginning, as if the FBI didn't think that it was her input was that important. What do you say about this, Alana Valdez, that you had assigned a name to her for your purposes?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Gary. That's an important point here, and this had never come out before. The NSA played a huge role in this case in helping to identify Ana Montes. And there was an analyst there, and I give her the pseudonym of Elena Valdez, who's a Cuban American. So she came here with her family when she was a young girl, really smart, ended up in college and graduate school, first in her family. And she ends up as an analyst at the NSA. The NSA, is constantly tracking communications around the globe, and they got onto the communications between Cuba and agents here. They kept talking about an Agent S, mysterious Agent S, and this analyst at the NSA put this information together, held a meeting with the FBI, and presented it to them. It was very specific information. One example, it said that Agent S had been to Guantanamo Bay within basically like a 1 month period in 1996, I believe it was. That alone, she thought, should be an incredibly helpful clue. How many people go to Guantanamo Bay? It's a closed base. There are records. And so she handed this to the FBI. The FBI investigates. They really didn't get anywhere for a long time. And out of frustration, this analyst reached out to other Cuba experts within DIA. She, at the time, Elena, had no idea that the spy, Agent S, she didn't know it was a woman, a man, and she certainly didn't know what agency this person worked at. So it was coincidental. She met a couple guys from DIA. She thought they were pretty sharp. They knew a lot about Cuba and counterintelligence. And she went behind the back of the FBI out of sheer frustration after about 2 years of the FBI working this case. And she shared information with the DIA. DIA took that and in about a day narrowed it down, realized that it was likely Ana Montes. Wow. And then there's a long period where DIA is presenting evidence to the FBI. The FBI discounted it early on. They thought it had to be a man. They believed that the suspect likely worked at CIA. And as you guys probably know, there's a pecking order within the intelligence world, and the FBI and the CIA are up here, and DIA is, as you know, they're bench players in this community. So they really didn't get a lot of respect. But it was this NSA analyst working with Scott Carmichael, who was at DIA, and some other folks there as well, who figured out that it was likely Montes. And one of the keys here was in looking at the travel logs to and from Guantanamo Bay. Her name popped up. And this officer, DIA officer, Scott Carmichael, also wrote a book several years ago about this case. Scott saw her name on basically a list of suspects, and he knew about her. He had actually interviewed her because one of his colleagues had thought that her behavior was suspicious. He basically thought she was going to meetings where she really didn't have any reason to be there. So he had done an interview with her a couple years earlier. It was inconclusive. He kind of thought that she was lying to him, but it never went anywhere. And it wasn't until years later when he got this tip from this NSA analyst and started looking at a couple different clues, and her name popped up, and Scott said, "Oh my God, I talked to her before. I thought she was BSing me then." And they started to dig into it. And Ana Montes popped up. She checked the box on all the other clues that the NSA had provided. So this is all going on behind the scenes and behind the back of the FBI, which infuriated them when they learned that this analyst had shared information about an espionage case with others at DIA, and Lord knows where it went from there. They really got upset, and they threatened to have her fired. They threatened arrest. They told her she probably needed a lawyer. She was really scared, and her career actually suffered as a result of it. Looking back, I think she acted bravely and heroically in this case. And if it weren't for her, I think Ana Montes would have been allowed to retire. We would never know about anything about her.
There's a lot to be said for what you just said. That's one thing is like, in retrospect, you can look back and like, trust your gut. But the thing is people's lives and careers are on the line. And every time you go talk to someone who acts weird, you just don't know, right? And you just don't have enough pieces. And so, oh my God, I talked to that person. But if it wasn't that person, or all the other times when you had that sensation and it doesn't go anywhere, like you just don't know, right? And so you don't get to trust your gut. You have to trust evidence. And there's not enough evidence there in these things. So it isn't that simple. And the FBI, God bless them, they try and they miss a lot. And
they miss. I want to say this because I don't want to beat up too much on the FBI.
Yeah,
early part of the case, I think you can credibly say they stumbled. It went very slowly, but they've made this point to me many times. They have to be super careful about who they share the information with, because they don't know. Let's say they went to someone at DIA innocently. Well, that could be the spy, or that could be the friend of the spy. So they have to be very careful about it. And they were under very strict orders to be super restrictive about it. And they had some information. As an example, the NSA had calculated, based on the communications, that 70% of the time they referred to Agent S as he and 30% as she. So they took that and they said 70 to 30, it's likely a guy. And spies, I think the figure is something like 10 to 15% in the modern era have been women, and all the rest have been men. So they believed it was likely a man. And so when Scott Carmichael comes to the FBI and says, "Oh, we know who it is, and it's a woman," they discounted it. But these cases are really hard to figure out. So I don't want to be too tough on them. And once they had the name Ana Montes, the FBI kicked in, the machine kicked in, and they did a fantastic job of wrapping up the case.
At that time, did they realize that she had those other connections to the FBI? And would that have spurred them to listen a little more closely to what the allegations were?
They didn't know at first, and when they learned, some of them were quite panicked because, if you think of the Walker family, I think they worried that, oh my God, do we have a spy ring here? But they pretty quickly eliminated that as an issue. They got FISA permission, so there were wiretaps going on. They were watching her around the clock for a period of time, and concluded that the family was innocent.
I had another question about Scott Carmichael. Within the DIA, do they have their own small counterintelligence group that have a responsibility of trying to find spies within their own organization?
Yes, and that was Scott's job. Scott's job, and obviously others as well, was counterintelligence to find spies within the agency, and he'd done that previously. So he didn't do background checks or that kind of thing. His whole mission in life was to try to find compromised employees of the DIA and the Pentagon writ large, not just DIA.
I read somewhere that the DIA now has a training video for DIA personnel that uses the Ana Montes case as an example of how things are compromised within the DIA.
Yeah.
Have you had a chance to see that training video?
I have. That's now online. DIA never officially released it, but someone did. And actually, it's very helpful to me. Among other things, it was the only. I got a screen grab of her in prison. It's the only prison photo that I was ever able to find of her. But there also were a number of her colleagues who spoke out, including one in silhouette who I was easily able to identify, talking about how she built this fiction over the years, and then also what it was like for them to learn that a colleague had spied for the other team for so long. One of them basically said, "I felt like my whole career just gone up in flames. Everything that I provided, she knew about. Everything I analyzed and wrote, Ana Montes knew about." And it made it to Havana faster than sending something in the mail, because she was talking to Havana every couple of weeks, and he just felt like I just wasted the last 10 years of my life.
Was there ever any mention at all of flipping her back as a double agent?
Not that I'm aware of. That's a good question. I have to ask my buddies about that, but not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, she's ideological, so probably not, right? Because then she gets tripled back on you. But it is that is part of the goal when you're a counterintelligence agent. It's like, all right, you're a bad person. You're doing something against us. What if we sweeten the deal? And you'd rather have that bad person working for you than against you. So
yeah, if anyone ever was interested in that, it would have been early on. What happened after 9/11? So they're on to her end of 2000. Just to ground everyone here, Hansen is arrested in, I think it's February of 2001, and they continue to monitor and watch Ana Montes in 2001. They kept her at DIA. And the director of DIA knew that he had an accused spy working there, and they continue to allow her to see classified information, but they're heavily monitoring her. That was big of DIA to have a Cuban agent within your ranks and just let it play out, because the FBI was hoping that she would meet with her handler and they can catch her, just like Hansen. if you remember in that case, he delivered classified documents to a park in Virginia. The FBI went in, they had him red-handed, and that's why, he spent the rest of his life in prison. They wanted to do the same thing with Montes. Then 9/11 happens. And I interviewed the Admiral Wilson, who's the then director of DIA, and he said, after 9/11, I had a lot going on. First of all, the plane that hit the Pentagon killed DIA employees. So he was dealing with, grieving family members and colleagues. DIA becomes the main agency planning our response in Afghanistan. And he's got a live, at this point, accused Cuban spy in the agency. Yeah. It was a lot. And Admiral Wilson said he ultimately went to the FBI and he said, guys, time is up. Yeah. You have to arrest her on, it was a Friday, I believe, excuse me, or, I'm going to fire her. It's enough already. And so that was it. The FBI realized they had to move in, and they did. They arrested her on the final day.
Yeah, things got tactical real fast, right? Like they had no time for strategic games. Yeah.
I have another question about Scott Carmichael. Did he write his book after the arrest, or mid-sentence, I guess you would say, of Ana?
Scott wrote his book, started writing his book while the case was still active. And this created a lot of controversy. When the FBI realized that Scott was working on a book prior to Ana being sentenced, they went ballistic. And I mean, the two agencies already had a bad relationship. This really blew it up. And to this day, there's still some tension between the two camps. But Scott had approval to write the book. He changed a number of facts to kind of protect the innocent, if you will. But it created a lot of tension. And the FBI was worried that had this gone to trial, whatever he had written and drafts and everything else could be used by the defense against the FBI. And that would have been a nightmare.
So when did Scott write his book? Was it while he was in prison?
Trying to think of the chronology. It came out a couple years after the sentencing, but he had, started taking notes and he started writing drafts while she was in prison, but she had not yet been sentenced. And that was the rub right there, that this is, it's an open case at that point. She's providing information to the FBI in debriefs, but they needed to make sure that she had fully cooperated before they could go ahead and recommend that she be sentenced and get this 25-year sentence and not life in prison. So it was a very tense time. The FBI agents who worked the case were furious with Scott for writing it without their knowledge and prior to the case being fully adjudicated.
Now, I read that Peter Lapp, the FBI agent, has also written a book called Queen of Cuba. And in the ad, it indicates that he releases information not previously published. Have you had a chance to see a draft of his book?
I haven't. Pete was the agent, one of the two agents that helped arrest Montes, and he deserves full credit for all the the great investigative work that he did, including several surreptitious entries into her apartment, her condo, prior to arrest. Pete's book is coming out in the fall, I believe, and but I've not seen a draft now.
I wanted to just close out here with a little bit of looking forward and speculation, and I do not want to have a political conversation, but when you got a couple of guys that look at this stuff, we've had a lot of problems within Congress and the senior presidential secretary sphere of compromised intelligence, I guess is the best way to say it, right? So we're putting a blanket over everybody here. And we know how hard it is to find these folks who are compromising our intelligence. Does it give you pause? Like when you look at how improbable catching Montes was, does it give you pause when you see such a reluctance to hold anybody accountable from, say, representative up to president? Does it give you pause when you see that kind of news story, or is it like, that's just politics as normal? I don't know. What do you think when you see a reluctance to, when you see, look, we open a counterintelligence investigation on China every 18 hours, you know?
Yeah.
And so when we see them constantly pecking at us, right? Mm-hmm. It gives me the willies as a counterintelligence agent. But what do you think when you see all of these failures to secure things? When you see a Chinese, spy working on Dianne Feinstein's, staff? And again, I'm not trying to say Democrat or Republican, but these people, if they're on one side, they're everywhere in my world, right? But what are your thoughts?
I think it's a really serious issue, and it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. There are constant attempts, some many successful, to infiltrate U.S. government and steal our national security secrets. I'm troubled by that. I live in D.C. and I'm always fascinated by the kind of the spy versus spy stuff that goes on here day to day. It just happens kind of behind the scenes. And it makes me think about this case and the miscues here. Mm-hmm. This is an example. Montes gets hired. She originally worked for the Justice Department in the Freedom of Information Act office, the FOIA office. It's kind of low level, but she had a clearance, security clearance at the time. She's basically grandfathered into DIA without a polygraph. She was only polygraphed once at DIA, and it happened years later. They also ignored all kinds of red flags in her file, including that someone at the Justice Department said they didn't think that she was loyal to the United States based on her political point of view. And so, I look at that and I just think it's hard work, but there also were a lot of mistakes that were made. I'm very familiar with the Hansen case. The same is true there. There was a lot that could have been investigated much earlier with Hansen as well. So these are hard cases to prove, but the government agents who are working on it need to do their job and truly investigate when these red flags do crop up. And so that's kind of where I come out on this. I'm with you. I don't really look at it politically. I don't care in this case that it was Cuba. The point is, she's an American citizen. She's working for a U.S. intelligence agency. Yeah. You are not allowed, for political reasons, financial reasons, to decide on your own that you're going to share classified information with an enemy. That's just not kosher. And we need to prosecute people who do that.
Yeah.
I think it's important for the polygraph operator to have his own insights on what kind of questions need to be answered and are likely to show deception. If they have a stock list of questions that anybody can prepare for, like, have you traveled outside of the country? And they get an easy answer. But if they say, did you ever travel to Cuba under another name? To me, that would say psychologically, she's going to react differently than a non-specific question. And I got a feeling that the polygraphers probably don't have the right questions to ask for a typical polygraph examination.
Yeah, you're probably right. And, I know, obviously, polygraphs are controversial. They're not admissible in courts of law, but they're a tool, and they can be extremely useful as an investigative start to an, to something, to look at someone who appears to be, giving false information. It's generally a starting point for a good investigator, and that definitely did not happen in this case.
And I would add to what Gary is saying, there are at least 10 questions, if not 15, that are, and you only get so much time. Like if you're there doing a background investigation, you don't have much time. And if 15% of your questions are laughably useless, are you a terrorist?
Right.
No. Do you intend to overthrow the United States government? No. And I mean, these are actual questions that we ask, right? Like, why are we doing that, right? Like, let that person develop the skill to be able to talk to this person, even if they ask questions that are not 100% on the nose. Let them do that to get a sense for the person, because what those questions do is just they go nowhere. Like, oh, is this the part of the survey where I just keep saying no to you? Like, and that's what happens, right? And then when you go to the person who's adjacent and the person who's adjacent to that adjacent person, don't waste our time, our tax money, just asking questions like no. This is the part where I keep saying no. And then I always cut them off and say, I completely trust Jim Popkin. You're going to ask me all these questions rather than me telling you no. Let me just tell you this. I trust him with my life. Don't ask me all those dumb questions. I'm just telling you right now, because I know the game with that.
Right.
But that's literally what happens. That person gets paid to go out, and a lot of that interview is wasted because it's just closed questions with obvious answers that anybody who wanted to deceive us could easily say no to. That's my point.
Yeah. Good point, Pete.
All right. Anything you want to say in closing, Gary? Let's give you the spotlight for a second. This is Gary's inaugural podcast episode, so it's super exciting for him.
It's been many years since I was doing counterintelligence work, but back when I was doing background investigations and things, we had a form, DD Form 398. And it's my understanding that the DD Form 398 has been modified to eliminate some of the key questions on that personnel questionnaire because of a more progressive political perspective. Back when I was active, they were asked if they had specifically been a member of the Communist Party or things like that. I don't believe they're allowed to ask those kinds of questions or some of the other personal questions like have you ever smoked marijuana, and a few things like that. I think that we've made it easier for people to cover their past by not asking questions in the 398 or whatever replaced the Form 398. And I had one other question was, is there a single agency now that does the background investigations for security clearances for all of the major agencies, or are there separate agencies that do it, like FBI for FBI agents? In the military, the defense used to be the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. I think they replaced the DCI, but it may be a name change. But was the mission ever consolidated so that there's a more focused effort to do background investigations that will be useful and accurate?
I know the Bureau still does, a vast majority of the background investigations, but there are a number of the key intelligence agencies, definitely add to that as well. But I really, to tell you the truth, I really don't know what is happening now, what's happened over the last couple of years. With that said, I don't want to steer you down the wrong road. I'm familiar with what happened with Montes, but as I've mentioned, she was arrested in 2001. So my info is a little dated.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff is contracted out now too, because the amount of people working in that field has exploded, and it's been hard to keep up. Hey, thanks so much for coming on the show, Jim, and would love to have you back on anytime you have something to talk about, because obviously it's neat to talk about this stuff in depth, and if nothing else, Gary and I had a good time. Anything in closing you want to get into?
No, not really. Appreciate you guys. We think we kind of covered the waterfront here, and folks want to reach out, or my website, the book again is Code Name Blue Wren. Easy to find me. Shoot me an email. Love to talk to folks about this story. One great thrill for me has been, since the book came out in January, a number of people have reached out who used to work with Ana Montes and shared, news stories and details about the case. And I'm happy to engage and love nerding out about this story. So keep it coming.
Awesome. Let me run these credits.
I had one other question. I really enjoyed the TV series, The Americans. What will this new series or new movie be that covers the Ana Montes story?
From your mouth, we're hoping that it does become a series at some point, but I've got no news on that just yet. And unfortunately, there's a writer's strike going on right now. But I agree with you. I think it's an incredible story, true story. I also love The Americans, and I think it'd be perfect for a dramatic, retelling.
All right, stand by. We'll wrap this up.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to. Curated